Have you ever watched someone quietly walk away from everything they knew, only to later discover they were the most vital person in the room? That's what happened to a woman named Aria Mendez. She had lived under the radar, quietly dismissed and underestimated, until the moment her scar lit up the scanner and exposed a truth no one on that military base was prepared for. They had ordered her off the premises, doubted her presence, questioned her credentials, and accused her of impersonating someone she clearly was not, until technology betrayed their assumptions and illuminated a secret buried deep beneath government archives, one that would change the course of national defense policy forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Aria Mendez was never the kind of person who drew attention. She lived in the spaces between headlines and held a posture so composed it bordered on invisible. At 29, she had that kind of youth that seemed aged by experience, quiet eyes, military posture, and a demeanor that made others unconsciously step aside. That morning, she arrived at Fort Halbert like any other civilian contractor, carrying a sealed briefcase, her military-issued badge, and a facial expression that revealed nothing. It was her third week assigned to the newly classified Phase 4 Blackout Ops program, a program so classified even those in uniform weren't entirely sure what they were protecting. She had been tasked with a systems diagnostic deep inside the base's dormant Cold War-era surveillance vaults, but it was her presence, more than her task, that seemed to unsettle people. You wouldn't have guessed she'd stirred any trouble at all. She followed protocol. She logged in on time. She spoke when spoken to. And yet, whispers traveled faster than her footsteps. Some officers on base doubted her clearance. Others questioned her credentials. A few began investigating her past, and what they found, or rather, what they didn't, only added fuel to the fire. Her file, while valid on the surface, lacked the typical digital trail. No social media, no university photos, no training videos or press awards. It was as if her past had been erased. That vacuum made others uneasy, especially those unaccustomed to holes in a government system designed to leave none. The tension reached a tipping point the moment she tried to enter Sector 9B. Technically, her clearance should have granted her access, but protocol required a full-body scan due to the classified materials inside. As she stepped into the scanner booth, security tightened. 2 guards approached. A third cross-checked her ID with unusual scrutiny. When the scan began, she stood still, arms at her side, scar exposed above her right collarbone, a subtle mark that looked like it could have been from a childhood fall or a surgical mishap. It had never drawn attention before, but as the blue grid scanned downward and paused over that scar, something unexpected happened. A high-pitched beep pierced the air, followed by a blinking red alert. Everyone froze. The screen flashed a string of encrypted characters, followed by a prompt none of the attending officers recognized. One of the technicians leaned in and muttered something unintelligible. The scanner rebooted mid-process. The scar had triggered something buried in the security algorithm. Something archaic, something deeply encrypted, something linked to Project Sentinel, a program that had officially been shut down over a decade ago. It was chaos for a moment, security on high alert, Aria surrounded by a tightening circle of guards. She didn't resist, she didn't even blink. She stepped back, lowered her briefcase, and said in a voice calm enough to silence the room, "Check the core ID log." One of the junior officers, uncertain and shaken, hesitated before pulling up a file restricted to Level 0 personnel. What he found shocked everyone. Her name wasn't just on the registry, it was embedded in the original source code of the Sentinel Project's biometric defense matrix. Her scar wasn't a wound, it was a living key. The scanner had recognized her not just as a person with clearance, but as part of the system itself. Yet that's not how the day had started. That morning, Aria had been a ghost walking through rigid halls. People dismissed her as a misplaced tech. Some even laughed about how quiet she was, calling her the shadow intern, behind her back. She was used to being overlooked, though not quite to this extent. But the problem at Fort Halbert wasn't that she'd gone unnoticed. It was that someone very high up had wanted it that way. The question now wasn't who she was, but why a woman like her had been hidden in plain sight for so long. And more importantly, what else had she been trained to unlock? Because once the scanner revealed her SCAR's encrypted signature, the entire base's operating system began to reconfigure, terminals rebooted, access points reshuffled, protocols auto-updated. It was as if the base itself had remembered her. Someone had buried her identity so deeply in the system's code that not even she knew the full extent of what she could access until the moment the machine saw her. What followed was the beginning of a storm, a reckoning that would pull apart rank, policy, and history. But before any of that unfolded, Arya stood motionless in the booth, surrounded by soldiers whose authority she had quietly outranked all along. And even then, she said nothing. Because the truth didn't need defending. It only needed time, and a scanner sophisticated enough to finally see her. Before the world saw the scanner light up with a buried signature, before high-ranking officers exchanged panicked glances and data systems cracked themselves open in recognition, Arya Mendez was just a name on a schedule, just a technician slotted for a system diagnostics rotation, 3 weeks into a temporary clearance assignment. She arrived each morning in the same regulation boots, dark gray utility pants, and reinforced vest, her raven black hair always pulled into a braid, tucked beneath the collar of her jacket. Her face was clean and alert but never inviting, as if she'd long ago trained every muscle to neutral. She moved through Fort Halbert like someone who had no interest in making friends, no need for small talk, and no desire to explain herself. And perhaps that was what unnerved people most. Her silence wasn't guarded. It was natural. Arya rented a single-room unit outside the south gate, a half-hour walk from the perimeter, though she always took the longer route through the eastern checkpoint. She said it was for the view, but the truth was more tactical. That route let her map out guard rotation patterns, survey the outer sensor alignments, and count the number of times per day the drones flew overhead. These weren't assignments. No one told her to do it. But every morning, as she walked with her standard-issue bag on one shoulder, she logged the changes, the anomalies, the shifts in base routine. And every evening, she wrote them down in a thin black notebook, marked only with a single embossed line: cycle. She had learned early in life to operate just below the threshold of suspicion. As a child growing up in the shadow of the El Viento mountain range in western Honduras, she'd often watched soldiers patrol through broken villages and wondered how their uniforms gave them such invisible power. Her mother had been a teacher, quiet and exacting, who taught Arya that real strength lived in silence. Her father had been a systems analyst who vanished 1 week before her 10th birthday, reportedly caught in a cross-border sting no one would admit to. Arya was never told what happened, but she remembered the man in the doorway that day, the American in civilian clothes who looked at her for a second too long before nodding once and leaving with her father. That look had haunted her, not because it was sinister, but because it wasn't. It was recognition. By the age of 17, she'd graduated from an advanced placement program run by a joint defense agency, though it was never officially listed as such. She received acceptance into a U.S. cybersecurity fellowship that required no college transcripts. By 19, she'd passed through 3 military-adjacent programs with code names she was forbidden to speak aloud. Most of the people in those programs were older, louder, and more accustomed to the spotlight. Arya stayed in the shadows, observing everything, logging everything, filing it away in a mind like a reinforced vault. She never asked for promotions. They came anyway, not because she sought power, but because she was the only one who could see patterns no one else could detect. By 25, she had worked on a project no one ever confirmed existed, Project Sentinel, a biometric encryption and surveillance initiative designed to respond to off-grid threats using embedded human signatures as keys. She hadn't volunteered, she had been selected. The process had involved a surgery she barely remembered, a training course that rewired her instincts, and a severance of all personal data footprints. Her social media, student records, and birth registrations had been wiped under something called Directive Echo 9. She became a ghost with fingerprints that didn't trigger alarms, but embedded them. Then the program was shut down, or so she'd been told. They gave her a new name, new paperwork. They folded her back into civilian contracts and sent her from base to base like a loose wire no one knew how to terminate. Ham base. She was too qualified to dismiss, too obscure to promote, and that suited her just fine. At least, until her assignment to Fort Halberd, a decommissioned Cold War base recently revived under the pretense of cyber infrastructure modernization. But Arya had seen the signals. She had read between the requisition lines, cross-referenced the facility's new layout with topographic anomalies, and sensed something buried here, something from her past. In the weeks before the scanner incident, Arya spent most of her time inside Sublevel 4, cataloging outdated command protocols and testing mainframe redundancies. She was meticulous and fast. But more than that, she was cautious. Every interface she touched with awareness. She could tell which systems were real, and which were decoys, which signals were bait, and which were echoes from another age. She noted that the command line had code that hadn't been used since Sentinel. She saw error messages that mirrored protocols she herself had written, buried deep in the framework of biometric defense layers that were supposedly gone. The scar on her collarbone itched whenever she got too close to certain data points, and though she told herself it was in her head, she kept track. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. No one else on base noticed her quiet study. They saw her as temporary, disposable. One of the field techs even referred to her as the ghost girl, laughing as if he didn't realize he was more right than wrong. Others were wary. The more competent ones recognized there was something about her that didn't fit. But no one said anything. Because Arya never gave them a reason to look deeper. She clocked in, did the work, and left without so much as a ripple. But that didn't mean she was content. Inside, Arya Mendez carried a slow-burning question. Why had she been sent here, of all places, of all times, and who still knew what she really was? She didn't know the answers yet, but she could feel them forming, just below the surface, waiting, and when the scanner lit up days later, it wasn't just revealing her. It was confirming what Arya had long suspected. She wasn't at Fort Halberd by accident. She had been placed here, like a time-release mechanism, activated not by choice, but by necessity. A legacy no one wanted to acknowledge was about to come roaring back into relevance. And she was the key. Fort Halberd didn't feel like a military base. It felt like a leftover idea, a half-erased blueprint that someone had tried to modernize without understanding its original purpose. Perched on the edge of the Windvale Mountains in northern Utah, the compound spanned hundreds of acres but remained largely empty, save for a rotating crew of contract workers, low-level officers, and shadowed figures who came and went without names. From a distance, the base resembled a relic from another time, squat concrete structures with peeling beige paint, towers that hadn't been used since the Cold War, and long corridors of reinforced steel doors that led to nowhere, or so it seemed. But beneath the surface, Fort Halberd was more alive than it appeared. Its sublevels whispered through dormant ventilation shafts, its ancient surveillance nodes still blinked faintly behind rusted panels, and its biometric sensors hummed low, even in rooms marked as decommissioned. The air around the base carried a cold stillness, the kind that didn't come from the wind but from memory. The soil was dry and packed tight, cracking in places where old pipelines lay buried. Surveillance drones flew lazy, predictable paths overhead, mostly for show. The outer perimeter was lined with motion-triggered fence alarms, but they rarely activated. No one truly expected a breach. The secrecy of the location, and its apparent uselessness was its best defense. Civilians weren't aware the base had reopened, and those working inside believed they were merely prepping it for long-term tech storage, repurposing the skeleton of the past for passive utility. But Aria Mendez saw it differently. The first thing she noticed on arrival was that the elevator to sublevel 3 had been rewired. Its keypad had been replaced with a biometric panel that registered retinal scans and fingerprint data, even though the entire level had allegedly been shut down 10 years ago. The second was that the command terminal in sublevel 4 ran off a hybrid OS that predated current military systems. Someone had intentionally kept it archaic, as if trying to preserve an old language within a modern interface. Aria recognized fragments of Sentinel's code buried in the system logs, command chains that only she and a handful of others in the world would have understood. It was like walking through the bones of something once alive, only to find its heart still beating, barely audible but present nonetheless. Each corridor inside Fort Halberd echoed too long. The acoustics were unnatural, designed for auditory surveillance. Aria would walk past vent shafts and catch snatches of whispered conversations that had taken place hours earlier, echoes caught in the metallic curves of the ductwork. The lighting was uneven, some hallways bathed in sterile white, others flickering with age-stained bulbs that cast shadows like slow-moving ghosts. Walls were lined with locked cabinets and conduit boxes whose wires no longer connected to anything visible. But Aria knew better. Some of the base's systems were rerouted underground. She found signs of hidden passageways beneath the maintenance grates, scuff marks, misplaced bolts, disturbed dust. Someone had been moving through areas not listed on any current schematic. The upper levels were inhabited by paper pushers and junior officers, men and women assigned to logistical management and contract oversight. They rotated weekly, few staying long enough to question the strange rhythms of the place. These personnel treated Fort Halberd like a temporary post, a forgettable blip on their service record. They complained about the remoteness, the outdated systems, the lack of signal strength for personal devices. But they didn't dig deeper. That was the point. The base was made to feel irrelevant. But underneath the bureaucratic theater, a quieter world churned. There was the room in sublevel 5 that Aria called the echo chamber. Officially, it was listed as a defunct diagnostics lab, but the electromagnetic signature of the space was irregular. Every device she brought near it failed temporarily. Audio playback devices reversed sound. Once, she even saw her own tablet screen flicker and display an archived Sentinel sequence from a project folder that hadn't existed in over a decade. The room rejected modernity. Or maybe it remembered something it wasn't supposed to. Either way, Aria logged everything. She noted the EM fluctuations, the temperature drops, the magnetic interference. It wasn't random. Something beneath the base's surface was still operational. Hidden, yes, but active. The mess hall was another oddity. Located near the northern wing, it had been retrofitted with facial recognition turnstiles, not uncommon for secure facilities, but unusual for a location that served a skeleton crew. Aria observed that certain personnel never used their cards or facial scans. They were simply knotted through by invisible clearance. These individuals wore no name tags, held no military ranks, and avoided eye contact. She called them, quote, the quiet ones. They moved with purpose, disappearing into sectors not found on any official base map. She tracked one of them one evening just for curiosity, only to lose sight of him after he slipped into a door labeled Generator Control, a door that, according to the floor plan, led to a sealed-off wing. And then there was the scanner, the one installed in Sector 9B. It stood like a relic of a future that never happened, framed in chrome and pulsing with a blue light that never seemed to dim. Most people walked through it without issue. But Aria always had a subtle tightness in her chest when she passed by. It wasn't fear, it was recognition. She could feel the technology beneath her skin reacting, pulling, humming in silent language. She avoided that wing until the day her assignment required it. Until the day her scar responded to the scanner's pulse and the entire base blinked awake. The physical structure of Fort Halberd was just a mask. Beneath the concrete and bureaucratic routines lived a layered machine, one built to remember the past, to bury it, and to wait. Arya sensed it with every step she took. The chipped paint, the locked sublevels, the embedded tech that shouldn't work but did. It was all part of something larger, something unfinished. The base wasn't just a place. It was a question that no one wanted to ask anymore. A question written in code, stored in shadows, and waiting for the one person who still knew how to answer it. And now that person had arrived. Colonel Barrett J. Royce had served for nearly 3 decades, most of it in high-security clearance roles that were buried so deep in the military intelligence community they didn't exist on paper. He was the kind of man whose uniform never showed a wrinkle, whose boots clicked with intention, and whose words were often fewer than needed, but heavier than most could bear. His presence was always a warning, silent, controlled, and cold. At Fort Halberd, Royce operated as both commander and gatekeeper, an unofficial overseer of operations that no longer had official names. And when he did speak, it was with the kind of authority that didn't come from rank alone. It came from knowing what others weren't allowed to know. The arrival of Arya Mendez triggered something in him long before the scanner ever lit up. From her first day, Royce had flagged her profile for internal audit, not because of what was on her record, but because of what wasn't. He noticed the absence of typical cross-reference metadata, the voids in her background that no algorithm could reconcile. Her clearance checked out, her assignments were valid, and her access codes authenticated against 2-factor encryption keys issued by Central Command. And yet, Royce knew that someone, somewhere, was hiding something. It wasn't the missing data that troubled him. It was that the military systems themselves had accepted it without question. That suggested tampering on a level beyond routine forgery. It suggested access from the top. And Royce didn't like questions he couldn't trace back to a source. But Royce wasn't simply motivated by curiosity. He had his own ghosts to keep buried, specifically his connection to Project Sentinel. Though the program had been publicly terminated years ago, Royce had been one of its handlers during its initial rollout. He had overseen biometric integration in the early phases, including the implantation of prototype encoding into select agents. He remembered the files, the procedures, the surgical consents, though most were redacted even from his view, and he remembered the failure that forced the program's closure. Sentinel hadn't been shut down because it didn't work. It had been shut down because it worked too well, and made too many powerful people nervous. Agents like Arya weren't supposed to exist anymore. They were decommissioned, reabsorbed, or erased. Most were never aware of the full extent of their integration into the Sentinel matrix. It was a calculated safety protocol. No operative could leak what they didn't know they carried. Royce had signed off on that directive. Echo 9. It had been called the final step in memory compression and operational burial. Arya was supposed to be gone, but here she was, walking through his base, triggering scanner algorithms that hadn't run in over 10 years. That made her a threat. Royce's conflict wasn't with Arya personally. It was with what she represented, a breach in control, a hole in the silence he had spent years preserving. Everything about Fort Halberd had been carefully curated to seem like a relic, a place of low consequence, low visibility, and high insulation. If someone like Arya could appear here, it meant someone knew, someone had placed her. And that meant Royce was no longer the sole custodian of the truth he thought he had buried. She wasn't a puzzle to solve. She was a fire alarm, and he had no idea who pulled it. He began moving pieces immediately. He ordered a secondary background verification, routed through an unofficial channel he trusted more than the central system. He placed 2 discrete surveillance taps on her workstation terminals, neither of which triggered any unauthorized access alerts, which only deepened his concern. Either she was exactly who she claimed to be, or she was better than anyone he had ever encountered. Royce didn't believe in coincidences. He believed in operations, and Arya Mendez was clearly one, whether she knew it or not. Royce's methods were never loud. He didn't confront, he encircled. The first sign of his pressure came in the form of scheduling shifts. Arya was reassigned to equipment audits in lower security wings. A second contractor was assigned to assist her, though he was actually a former intelligence analyst trained in behavioral surveillance. Lunchroom cameras were redirected. Her movement patterns were logged. When Arya requested updated network access for Phase 4 diagnostics, her request was delayed, then denied. When she filed a technical override form, it disappeared from the queue. Royce wasn't testing her capabilities. He was tightening the loop, waiting to see when and how she would respond. He briefed only one other person, Major Eileen Carver, the base's embedded psychological strategist. Carver's job was to profile personnel for potential risk indicators, and Royce assigned her to monitor Arya through passive interactions. Arya never spoke enough to profile easily, but Carver noted her observational patterns, her pattern recognition habits, and her uncanny awareness of base routines. Her conclusion was troubling. Arya was either a deep cover operative unaware of her conditioning or an asset awakened without a handler. Either way, Carver suggested containment protocols. Royce agreed. Containment began with subtle isolation. The personnel, who once nodded at Arya in the hallway, stopped acknowledging her. Her clearance was downgraded slightly, enough that she couldn't access Sublevel 4 without supervisor approval. Her access card occasionally failed at checkpoints, requiring manual override. Each time, she remained calm, never questioned, never complained, which only added to Royce's suspicion. She wasn't reacting like a frustrated tech. She was behaving like someone running an invisible protocol of her own, monitoring them just as much as they were monitoring her. But the real conflict ignited the moment she approached Sector 9B. Royce had ordered that scanner installed as a failsafe, not as a security checkpoint, but as a diagnostic gate keyed to residual sentinel markers. It wasn't supposed to activate. It hadn't activated in over a decade. But when Arya stepped through it, and the scar above her collarbone illuminated with that pulse-reactive signal, it changed everything. The conflict was no longer theoretical, it was alive, and for the first time in years, Royce felt something slip from his grasp. Not control, but certainty. And that terrified him more than anything else. Ava found herself standing in the rain outside the gates of Fort Rainier, her duffel bag at her feet, the water soaking into the canvas until it grew heavy with weight. She didn't move for several minutes after being escorted out. Her orders were non-negotiable, and her clearance had been stripped. The silence in her ears was louder than the hum of the military vehicles driving by, and the sound of the gate clanking shut behind her seemed to echo into her soul. She had never been more alone. Even during her recovery, even when she lay still and unconscious for days, even when her parents couldn't recognize her face through the burns and swelling, she had felt more tethered to the world than she did now. What stunned her most was not the betrayal of her fellow officers, but the rapid ease with which she had been erased, as though years of sacrifice, training, and life-risking deployments could be deleted in the time it took a retinal scanner to blink red. She left the military base not knowing where to go next. Her stipend had been paused pending further review. The tiny apartment she had just signed for off-base wouldn't allow her to move in without proof of income. So she did the only thing she could think of. She took the last of her savings and checked into a modest, half-forgotten motel on the outskirts of the city, one of those roadside places that still used actual keys and hadn't updated their sign in 2 decades. The room smelled faintly of mildew and cleaning fluid. She didn't unpack. She simply sat on the bed, staring at the TV that wasn't turned on. Ava didn't cry. She had run out of tears a long time ago. Instead, her mind began to churn, not in self-pity, but in silent analysis. Who had initiated the shutdown of her clearance? Why had the moment at the gate felt so rehearsed? And most of all, what was it about the scar, the one she had hidden under her sleeve since the day she woke up in the recovery unit, that had triggered the base's emergency protocol? The next morning, she went to the local VA office to ask about her case and whether they had heard anything from the base. The receptionist, though kind, told her the file had been locked at the federal level. Not flagged, not missing, locked. That kind of action wasn't taken unless someone at the top wanted her silenced. As she stepped out of the building, the sky still heavy with storm clouds, Ava felt something shift inside her. They weren't just erasing her, they were hiding something. And she wasn't going to let them. She spent the next few days combing through everything she had access to: emails, deployment reports, even her own discharge paperwork. She noticed strange patterns: a missing log entry during the incident that caused her injury, redacted medical records from the field hospital, and names that appeared on her operation briefing that had no known military affiliation. She tried reaching out to the one person she thought might help: Drive. Eliana Grant, a civilian contractor who had once overseen advanced trauma studies at a nearby medical lab and had visited her once during her recovery. But when Ava called the contact number she had for her, the line had been disconnected. When she searched the lab online, she found it had been shut down abruptly 2 months ago due to, quote, security violations. The deeper she looked, the more the pattern emerged. She wasn't just being silenced, she was being disconnected. Then, one night in her motel room, she stood in front of the mirror and rolled up her sleeve. The scar still shimmered faintly in the dim bathroom light, and with a trembling hand she touched the spot where the scanner had reacted. It didn't glow this time, but when she pressed her skin lightly, she felt something beneath it. Not scar tissue. Something harder, like a microplate. She remembered the agonizing pain she had felt when she first came out of surgery, when they said her shoulder had taken most of the blast. They told her metal fragments had been removed, but what if they had implanted something instead? She thought back to the dreamlike moments in recovery, the vague memory of someone standing over her bed whispering about stabilization and how her vitals had surged the moment they ran a thermal scan. The scar wasn't a mark of injury. It was a key. To what? She didn't yet know. But she was done sitting in the shadows. Ava began tracking down anyone who had been part of her recovery team. It took days of digging through military forums, encrypted email threads, and even calling in favors from people she hadn't spoken to in years. Many didn't respond. A few hung up. But one nurse, retired and now living in Arizona, called her back. She said she remembered Ava clearly. "You weren't supposed to wake up," the woman said. "They said if you did, we were to notify a special contact, not your commanding officer, not even the base doctor, but someone from a black badge group, no name, just a symbol." Ava asked what the symbol was. The nurse described it as a triangle, with a line bisecting it and 2 small dots on either side. Ava froze. That symbol was etched faintly into the edge of her scar, so faint it looked like an old suture mark. She had always assumed it was part of the skin graft. But now she understood. It was a mark, a designation. She wasn't just wounded, she was altered. The motel room walls felt tighter now. Her breaths came short. She was no longer safe. Not here, not anywhere. If they had locked her file, if they had scrubbed her access and pulled her out like a rogue asset, then whatever she carried inside her body was classified at a level she couldn't even begin to guess. But Ava wasn't afraid. She was furious, and that fury sparked the beginning of her next move. She wasn't just going to find answers. She was going to make sure that whoever had turned her into this living anomaly would be forced into the light. They had made her forget who she was. Now she would make them remember. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting an amber hue across the arid plains surrounding Fort Granger, Ava sat alone on the cold concrete steps of the barracks, her duffel bag resting beside her like a weight she couldn't shake. Every footstep in the distance made her flinch, as if expecting more bad news or another order to move further away. The echo of boots on gravel didn't bring comradeship anymore. It brought suspicion, distrust, and the chill of isolation. Her scar, the very mark that had once symbolized survival, now marked her as a danger. Every glance from fellow soldiers was laced with unspoken fear, and even those who had once stood beside her in the trenches now avoided her like she was contagious. The memory of the scanner lighting up and triggering a silent alarm haunted her like a ghost, replaying over and over, a loop of disbelief and shame. That night, she wasn't allowed back inside the barracks. They said it was for security protocol. She slept under a metallic overhang outside the mess hall, swatting mosquitoes and trying to ignore the cold seeping through her standard-issue jacket. It was a new kind of loneliness, one that crawled under her skin and whispered that she didn't belong anywhere. She remembered when she was a cadet, dreaming of deployment, imagining herself decorated with honor, saluted, respected. Now, even the cafeteria staff didn't meet her eyes. When she finally made her way inside the next morning, she found her clearance card had been deactivated. She couldn't even buy a coffee. The woman behind the counter gave her a pitiful look and said someone would be in touch with her soon. Ava nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat, and left empty-handed, her stomach as hollow as the silence around her. The next few days blurred into a disorienting routine of waiting and being watched. They hadn't fully discharged her yet, but they hadn't given her any duties either. It was as if they were waiting for something. Papers, orders, confirmation from higher up. But whatever it was, it kept Ava in a limbo she couldn't escape. She tried to make sense of what was happening. She went over every mission, every assignment, every conversation she had since joining the unit. She thought about the incident in the Caridian desert, where the scar originated. The explosion that ripped through the village compound had left her unconscious for hours, and when she woke up in the field hospital, her left arm had been surgically treated, fused with some kind of biofoam and internal nanotech to repair the nerves. She never asked many questions back then. She was just grateful to be alive. But maybe that was a mistake. Maybe the tech in her arm was more than just standard-issue biotech. And maybe someone had just realized it. She approached Captain Reese again, this time with a calmer tone, hoping to find answers, but he gave her nothing but cryptic remarks about classified evaluations and external oversight. Whatever was happening, it wasn't just a military issue anymore. She overheard whispers about private contractors and experimental gear, about off-the-record programs that used soldiers as test subjects. It chilled her to think she could be one of them. When she was summoned to a hearing, she thought it might be the end of the nightmare, but instead, it only made it worse. A panel of 3 officers and 1 suited man from an unnamed agency sat across from her in a cold, gray room. They asked if she had authorized modifications to her body. She said no. They asked if she remembered anything unusual during her recovery. She said no again. They slid a document toward her. "This is a pre-discharge agreement," they told her. "It's not official until we get further confirmation, but we'd recommend you begin preparing to leave base." Her hand trembled as she held the pen. She didn't sign. Not yet. Something inside her refused to give up without understanding what was being done to her. As she exited the room, the suit stood and called after her quietly. "You ever consider you were chosen for something bigger, Lieutenant?" he asked, his voice almost gentle. "Sometimes the things that set us apart are the very things others fear, until they're forced to respect them." She didn't reply. She just walked out, confused, broken, and unsure whether it was a threat, a warning, or a twisted form of encouragement. That night, she packed her things again, not because she was ordered to, but because she no longer knew where she stood. If she was being watched, she wanted to be ready. If they came to remove her forcibly, she wouldn't go without clarity. Sleep didn't come. She stared at the ceiling of the storage room they had let her use temporarily, her fingers brushing the ridged scar under her sleeve. She closed her eyes and tried to remember who she was before the war, before the scar, before everything went off the rails. She had enlisted to serve, to protect, to be part of something greater than herself. Now she was being treated like a time bomb. At rock bottom, the mind starts to wander into places it shouldn't. What if she was a risk? What if she couldn't trust her own body anymore? What if they were right to be afraid of her? And yet, something didn't add up. If she was truly a threat, why hadn't they detained her fully? Why were they stalling? What were they waiting to confirm? The questions looped in her brain until sunrise cracked over the base's outline. Ava rose, pulled her jacket on tight, and stepped out onto the parade ground, a ghost walking among the living. The scar on her arm pulsed faintly, like it knew something she didn't, like it was just waiting to awaken. Whatever was coming next, it wouldn't be ordinary. And she would need to decide, was she a victim of something out of her control, or was she the key to something far bigger than anyone dared to admit? The silence in the room was so thick that Alara could hear the buzzing of the fluorescent lights above her. Colonel Bowers remained standing, unmoving, eyes fixed on the paused footage of Alara's glowing scar in the biometric scanner. It was as if everyone was waiting for someone else to speak first, but no one dared to breathe too loudly. Finally, he turned around, his expression unreadable, and motioned for the technician to resume the footage. The holographic screen flickered as the moment replayed. Alara standing there, scanner humming, then flaring bright blue as it passed over her shoulder, the same spot where her scar had been. A flash, like a pulse of energy, and then the security system had glitched out completely, not crashed, overridden, as if something inside her had taken control of the base systems for that split second. Colonel Bowers lowered his arms, glanced at his advisors, and muttered something under his breath. One of them, Commander Leto, whispered urgently in response, throwing glances Alara's way like she might suddenly detonate. Then Bowers made a decision. He turned toward her, his voice calm but loaded. "You're coming with us. Now." Before she could question it, two heavily armed guards stepped forward, not to cuff her, but to flank her, like they were both protecting and containing something precious. She was led out of the scanner bay and down a corridor that didn't match any she'd seen in the base before. This one sloped downward slightly, its walls thicker, reinforced with some alloy she couldn't name. Her boots echoed dully on the floor, and the further they walked, the colder the air became, the hum of technology more muted. It felt like they were descending into the bones of the earth itself. They finally reached a door unlike the others, sealed with two biometric panels and a keycode lock that required both Bowers and Leto to access. When the door hissed open, it revealed what looked like a lab mixed with a control room. Screens filled one wall, showing biometric data, satellite feeds, and DNA structures. But the centerpiece was a cylindrical glass chamber in the middle, about 7 feet tall and pulsing faintly with a deep, golden light. Alara didn't need anyone to explain it to her. She felt it in her chest, in her scar, that same odd pulling sensation that had begun the moment the scanner reacted to her. She instinctively stepped closer, but Bowers raised a hand. "Not yet," he said. "You need to understand what you're looking at first." He explained that decades ago, during a classified expedition in the Arctic Circle, an international team of researchers had uncovered a site they called the Crucible, a massive crystalline structure buried beneath the ice, far older than any civilization known to man. The material it was made of couldn't be replicated or analyzed. Attempts to extract it caused every sensor to go haywire. Then one day, without warning, it emitted a single pulse of light. Those standing nearest had been changed, not harmed, but marked. One man's eyes turned silver for a week. Another's heartbeat synced with the vibration of the crucible. And one woman, an American specialist named Ilyana Rowe, had disappeared entirely, only to reappear 6 days later in the middle of the Sahara Desert, with no memory of how she'd gotten there. Bowers paused, then activated a screen. A photograph appeared. A woman in military fatigues, smiling awkwardly at the camera, her left shoulder bare, revealing a curved scar shaped like an inverted crescent. Ilara's breath caught in her throat. The scar was identical to hers. Bowers nodded grimly. "That's Ilyana, your mother." Ilara felt the ground shift under her. Everything inside her seemed to reel backwards. Her mother had died when she was a toddler. That's what she had always been told. Died in a fire in Jakarta. But here she was, on screen, listed as MIA classified. "You were born 6 months after she returned," Bowers continued, "and shortly after, she vanished again. This time, permanently. But before she did, she left you with a message. A legacy buried so deeply, even you wouldn't know about it until it was triggered. He turned to the chamber and gestured toward it. That's what this is. The Crucible sent out another signal 2 weeks ago. It's the first time since Ilyana's incident. And the signal wasn't random. It was targeted, directed here, to you. The glass cylinder pulsed brighter as he said it, and Alara's scar flared faintly in response. Her knees went weak. Whatever this thing was, it was connected to her down to the cellular level. Bowers explained that there was a belief among a handful of classified agencies that the Crucible wasn't a weapon nor a relic. It was a kind of gate, a bridge to something beyond our dimension, and only certain people, marked by it, could access it. Her mother had been one, and now, apparently, so was she. Ilara's mind spun. All her life she'd been average. She'd scraped through school, survived the streets, kept to herself, and never fit in. And now she was being told she was part of some interdimensional link to an ancient technology buried beneath the ice? It sounded like science fiction. It was science fiction. But her scar burned with a heat that was all too real, and every instinct in her told her that whatever was happening, whatever was coming, was not a hallucination or a trick. It was calling her. Colonel Bowers didn't push her for an answer. He simply told her that they were giving her the chance to enter the chamber, interface with the Crucible's secondary node, and see what it would reveal. But there was a catch. Once she stepped in, there would be no turning back. No one knew what might happen, whether it would react like before, or differently now. She might see visions. She might disappear. Like Ilyana, she might die. But one thing was certain. If she chose not to go in, the signal would keep escalating, and more systems around the world might begin reacting, potentially destabilizing every network tied to the Crucible's unseen influence. Ilara looked at the chamber. Her heart pounded, not with fear, but with a strange kind of certainty. She'd spent her whole life believing she was unwanted, a mistake. But now, she was the key to something bigger than anyone had imagined, and if her mother had left this behind, then maybe, just maybe, this was her way back to her. She took a deep breath and stepped toward the chamber. The wind swept across the wide expanse of the base, bringing with it a storm of conflicting emotions inside Selena. After the chilling encounter at the security checkpoint, she'd been left with more questions than answers. They hadn't let her through, but they also hadn't detained her. Instead, she'd been escorted by 2 heavily armed guards to a medical unit on the eastern wing of the base. No one would explain why. No one would speak a word to her. It was like she had become a ghost moving through a system that no longer obeyed the standard rules of military procedure. Every turn in the corridor, every hiss of an opening door, felt like it was being choreographed by a higher authority who had suddenly become very interested in her existence. The scan had changed everything. Her scar that once meant only pain and survival had lit up a scanner like a flare in the night. Someone, somewhere, had been waiting for that signal. Inside the cold, clinical room, she sat alone for hours. She had no idea what kind of scan they had performed, or why her scar had reacted that way. What kind of implant could do that? She wasn't chipped. She had never undergone anything experimental that she knew of. Yet there was no denying the result. Even the guards had frozen in place like they'd just seen a ghost. The memory of their wide eyes and the way their hands hovered over their weapons played over and over in her head like a glitching reel. Then they'd suddenly gone quiet, spoken into their radios, and diverted her to this sterile holding room without a word of explanation. Her mind cycled through possible reasons, each more unbelievable than the last. Eventually, a woman in a dark green military uniform walked in. Her insignia was high-ranking, higher than Selena had ever seen up close, and her face was unreadable, composed like a mask carved from granite. Without offering her name or position, the woman merely looked at her for a long time, as though evaluating whether Selena even deserved to know what was going on. Then, in an even tone, she asked for a recounting of the day Selena had been wounded. Not the sanitized version that made its way into the military files, but the real one. Selena hesitated at first. The memory was buried deep beneath layers of trauma she had long since stopped digging through. But something about the woman's stare made her understand this wasn't optional, so she told her everything. The mission in Syria, the explosion, the moment she thought she died, the dreamlike visions that followed, the days of silence in the enemy compound, and the strange way her body healed far too quickly afterward. The woman took notes, expression unchanged, and when Selena finished, she gave her a simple nod before walking out. Hours later, another set of footsteps echoed down the hallway. This time it was a man, older, wearing civilian clothes, but with an aura that screamed intelligence clearance. He introduced himself only as Dr. Kamran, a specialist in anomalous recovery cases tied to field incidents. Selena had never heard of such a position, but by now she had stopped questioning the abnormalities of her situation. He spoke gently, like someone trained to lower defenses. He told her the base's biometric scanners were equipped with layered heat signature recognition, DNA resonance fields, and rare mineral scans to detect hidden implants or biological anomalies. Her scar had activated a sub-level alert, something designed to flag not just any unusual pattern, but a very specific one. He didn't say it outright, but the implication was clear. Her scar matched something classified. Dr. Kamran then asked if she remembered anything strange, not just physically, but mentally or emotionally, since the day of the injury. Any dreams, unnatural instincts, enhanced perceptions, or sudden knowledge she couldn't explain. She said no, she had pushed all of it away. The whispers she sometimes heard when no one was there, the way she could sense people's emotional state before they spoke, even her increasingly vivid dreams where she saw herself in places she'd never been. She had assumed it was PTSD, or the side effects of trauma. But now, with this man staring at her like she held a secret even she didn't know, she wasn't so sure anymore. Later that evening, she was moved again, this time not by force, but with an invitation. A confidential program housed deep within the mountainside of the base, a facility not listed on any map. They called it Section Vale. It sounded like something out of a movie, but the security clearance and biometric checks were real enough. Inside, she was given a briefing by a small group of officials who described the existence of a very small number of soldiers across the globe who had survived impossible scenarios. Cases like hers, each marked by a specific anomaly, often a scar or internal alteration that reacted to classified technology. They didn't know the full picture, but they believed these individuals had experienced something beyond known science. The theories ranged from undiscovered biological evolution to exposure to alien technology. Selena couldn't believe what she was hearing, yet everything inside her told her it was the truth. She wasn't alone. For the first time, she began to piece together the inconsistencies in her life since the blast. Her accelerated healing, the dreams of symbols she'd never seen, her reflexes, which had improved beyond what training alone could explain. It wasn't just luck that kept her alive. It was something else, something deeper, etched into her very DNA, encoded in that scar. They offered her a choice: leave and pretend none of this ever happened, or stay and join a covert unit designed not for combat, but for uncovering the source of these anomalies. They believed she was connected to a larger puzzle, a global pattern that had begun to emerge in recent years. Most walked away, too afraid of the unknown. But Selena, who had already faced death and returned from it, didn't hesitate. She said yes. Captain Delaney walked back into the barracks that evening and found silence instead of the usual buzzing chatter. People looked up from their bunks, their cards, their cleaning duties. The energy had shifted, not just because Leora was reinstated, but because something larger loomed just beneath the surface, something unspoken but felt. It wasn't about rules anymore. It was about awe, mystery, and maybe fear. Delaney noticed how the younger recruits glanced at Leora with a strange reverence. Her presence had become something more than human. She was a symbol now, of something they couldn't quite grasp. He had seen the footage again and again, slowed it down frame by frame, analyzing every detail. When her scar had glowed under the biometric scanner, It wasn't a malfunction. The scanner had registered something embedded in her skin that reacted to military-grade clearance systems. Even the tech crew couldn't replicate the result in their simulations. They had tried to run diagnostics on the scanner itself, but it worked perfectly for everyone else. The mystery wasn't in the hardware, it was in her. Leora, meanwhile, had retreated into herself. She was back in uniform, allowed to train and move around, but she barely spoke. She performed her tasks with mechanical efficiency and no complaints, but her eyes had dulled. After the confrontation at the scanner, everything she thought she knew about herself seemed to shift. The only place she found solace was the training yard at dawn, when no one else was awake. She'd run the track, shadowbox beneath the bleachers, and whisper questions to herself in the dim light, hoping for answers she knew wouldn't come. Who put this in me? Why? What does it mean? Every time she caught her reflection, she stared at the faint scar and imagined it glowing again, imagined the heat and pull she had felt coursing through her blood when it lit up. She knew then that it wasn't just light, it was a signal, but to what, or to whom? That question echoed far beyond the barracks. Somewhere on the East Coast, in a sealed military think tank deep underground, men in suits reviewed her footage in silence. Project Meridian had long been classified, sealed away behind layers of bureaucracy and need-to-know permissions. But now, someone had triggered a reaction that matched a dormant protocol. Leora Wynn. That name didn't match any test subject from the original program, but the signature match was nearly perfect. One man leaned forward and tapped the screen. Her scar, if that's what it was, aligned perfectly with a dormant prototype design from 15 years ago. An experiment shelved after ethical concerns, wiped from the databases after whistleblowers got too close. And now, here it was again. Walking, breathing, glowing. Leora didn't know any of this. She only knew that she felt watched, not in the way she used to feel during basic training or under her commanding officer's gaze. This was different. It was colder, more clinical, like she was being cataloged. And she wasn't wrong. Within days of her reinstatement, new faces appeared on base. Men and women with tight smiles and looser rules, all carrying clipboards they never really wrote on. They asked questions with fake warmth. How was she sleeping? Any vivid dreams? How did she feel about the climate of the base? No one mentioned the scanner. No one mentioned the footage. But everyone knew. Leora played along, but deep down, her instincts flared with each casual conversation. She felt like a lab rat in a cage someone forgot to lock. Then one morning something changed. A silent alarm was triggered in the base's perimeter. A drone had picked up movement near the north fence. Nothing unusual, usually just a stray deer. But when the guards pulled up the thermal footage, the figure was too still, too precise. The man stood with military posture, face hidden under a dark hood, but there was no attempt to breach. He simply stood there, staring toward the base, toward her room, the infrared overlay showing a heat signature that pulsed unnaturally, like it was synced with something else. By the time guards reached the location, he was gone. No footprints, no trace. Only a single object left behind, placed neatly at the base of the fence, a patch with an insignia no one recognized, a swirling pattern, not of any known division or country. Delaney saw the footage before anyone else, and for the first time he felt genuine fear. He had served in war zones, seen things most men could never imagine, but this was different. This felt ancient, or futuristic, or both. That patch, that figure, it wasn't a threat in the traditional sense. It was a warning. And he knew, in his gut, that it had something to do with Leora. The next day she found the envelope on her bed. No name, no sender, just a sealed flap. Inside was a photo. A blurry image, clearly aged, of a woman standing in a desert field. She looked almost like Leora, but older, stronger. And on her shoulder, the same scar. glowing. Leora stared at the photo for a long time. Her hands trembled, not from fear but recognition. This wasn't just about her anymore. She was part of something larger, something buried in layers of time and secrecy. And she was beginning to realize the scar wasn't the beginning, it was a key. The room was still when Dr. Tamira Levesque arrived, clipboard in hand, eyes heavy with the burden of truths she wasn't sure she was allowed to share. Commander Albright, Colonel Pena, and Agent Remy were already seated around the long oak table, which had become the headquarters of the unofficial inquiry into Evelyn's presence. The mood was not combative, but tense, as though each of them had finally seen past the surface of this situation and glimpsed something vast, something old and tangled and out of reach. Dr. Levesque had been pulled in after the scar scan incident, not just because she was an expert in neurogenetic coding, but because she had classified access to military biometrics projects buried deep in forgotten files. Files that hadn't been opened in years, some even from before Evelyn was born. She set her clipboard down, looked at the men before her, and then at Evelyn, who sat at the far end, hands folded tightly on her lap, her posture straight but nerves visible in the way her shoulders stiffened with every pause in the conversation. Tamira took a breath and explained that what Evelyn had triggered at the scanner was not a typical military ID match. It was a legacy response, one designed to activate only under very specific genetic markers embedded during the Cold Genesis program, an abandoned initiative from over 30 years ago that sought to imprint combat operatives with identity-locked neural coding that could survive lineage transitions. In simpler terms, Evelyn's scar wasn't just a reminder of pain, it was a signal. A beacon genetically encoded with an identity tag that was never supposed to exist in the civilian world. According to the oldest logs Tamira could recover, Cold Genesis had only 4 known prototypes before the program was shut down for ethical reasons and internal sabotage. 3 subjects had died in containment. The 4th had vanished. And now, all these years later, a civilian with no known military record had triggered the scanner as that 4th subject's direct genetic descendant. Colonel Pena leaned forward, his voice low and dry, asking whether Evelyn could have inherited something like this unknowingly. Tamira nodded slowly, then clarified that these types of modifications, if indeed inherited through mitochondrial lines, could lie dormant for generations unless activated through physical trauma or intense stress, both of which Evelyn had experienced during the explosion that left her scarred. Commander Albright finally turned to Evelyn, his sharp features unreadable, and asked what she remembered about her family history. But Evelyn could only recall bits and pieces. Her mother had died when she was young, and her father had disappeared before she was born. She was raised by her grandfather, a quiet man who never spoke of the past and left behind no records. A man who may have known something he never dared to tell. As the room fell silent again, Agent Remy, who had remained mostly quiet throughout, opened a black folder he'd kept close to his chest. It contained a photo, grainy, old. A lab shot of a woman, strapped to a table, with a scar almost identical to Evelyn's, but on the opposite side. The caption below read, Prototype 04, Rain C. Evelyn's breath caught. The woman looked eerily familiar. Her eyes, her bone structure, even the way her lips curled slightly under pressure. It could have been her mother, or her grandmother, or someone even closer in the chain. Remy then placed a second page on the table, a list of encrypted names, all crossed out, except one. Under the designation Subject Reclamation Priority Omega, Evelyn's name had been printed, flagged, and filed 10 years ago by an unknown operative. The implication was terrifying. Someone had been tracking her long before she even knew who she was. Evelyn stood up, the weight of this impossible narrative crashing into her like a tidal wave. The scar on her side now felt like more than a memory. It was a message, a map to a life she hadn't lived but somehow still belonged to. But even more disturbing was the realization that if this information had been known by someone for that long, then the explosion in Dakar might not have been a coincidence. It might have been a trigger, set off deliberately to awaken whatever lay dormant inside her. Colonel Pena began strategizing next steps immediately, wanting to quarantine Evelyn and study the neural coding more. Commander Albright was more cautious, suggesting that if Evelyn had survived activation, then she might also be capable of things not yet understood, and perhaps not safe to test in confinement. But it was Tamira who spoke with the most clarity. She said that Evelyn was no threat. She was a product of something done without consent, without choice, and without understanding. And now the burden was on them, not to control her, but to support her in uncovering the truth of her lineage. Evelyn asked to leave the base, not because she was afraid, but because she needed to know more. If there were others like her, if this project had left echoes in the world, then she had a right to follow them. After a long pause, Albright finally agreed, on the condition that she stay in touch and wear a biometric monitor for her own safety. Evelyn accepted, and that night, as she left the briefing room and stepped out into the quiet of the desert wind, she felt like she was walking away from the only life she'd ever known and into one that had been waiting for her to awaken. The scar on her side tingled faintly, not with pain, but with a strange warmth, as if it recognized that she was finally moving in the right direction, toward answers, toward danger, toward truth. The lab was silent except for the low hum of equipment and the occasional beep from the scanning console. Captain Ellis stood stiffly in the corner, arms crossed and jaw clenched. Dr. Marin worked quickly but delicately, her eyes darting between the data and Ava, who now sat upright on the examination chair with a calm intensity that belied the storm beneath her skin. The biometric scan results pulsed across the screen, revealing what Marin had expected and feared. Ava's scar wasn't just old trauma. It was something far more advanced, something beyond the scope of medical science or military-grade implants. Embedded in the tissue was a complex network of bioneural filaments, interwoven with micro-reactive nodes that activated in response to specific frequencies. What shocked Marin most wasn't just the presence of this technology, it was the signature it carried. The code identifiers weren't from any known government or private contractor. They didn't match any human database. They pulsed with an energy spectrum that extended into bands no terrestrial tech used. The closest reference point was from a recovered crash site in Patagonia in 1997, an incident long buried beneath layers of secrecy, deemed by the defense community as a fluke of physics and natural phenomena. But now, that same signal signature was alive and glowing inside Ava's scar, responding to the scanner as if it recognized something, or someone. Ava watched the confusion ripple across Marin's face. She knew this would happen. She had felt the scar react before, but it had never flared so violently until that moment at the gate. Something had changed, triggered perhaps by proximity to the scanner or maybe by the energy in the restricted facility. Either way, it was awake now, and so was a part of her she had long tried to silence. "What am I looking at?" Ellis asked sharply, breaking the silence. Marin didn't answer at first. She zoomed in on the scan, layered filters over it, then ran a cross-reference search through the defense archives, pulling up a match history. Only one file came close, classified Tier 7, redacted so heavily it was practically black ink and white lines. But one phrase stood out under the project codename: Exo-Origin Interface Study, Subject 0. "She's not enhanced," Marin finally said, her voice a mixture of awe and disbelief. "She's interfaced." "Interfaced with what?" Ellis snapped. Marin exhaled. "Not with anything from here." Ava's gaze locked with Marin's. She wasn't scared, she was done hiding. "Tell him," she said calmly. "He's going to find out anyway." Marin looked back and forth between the two, then nodded slowly. "The energy signature in her scar doesn't match anything we've built. It doesn't even match what we've reverse-engineered from our own research. It's foreign. Alien, possibly. And it's not dormant, it's active." Ellis's face tightened. The air in the room grew heavier. "You're telling me we have a non-human tech embedded in a civilian who just walked into our most secure base, and it activated because What? Because she walked too close to a gate? It didn't just activate, Ava said. It recognized the signal from your scanner. And it responded. She stood up now, shoulders square. Whatever's in me, it's been there since I was a child. Since the crash. And I think it's always been waiting for something, someone, to find it. You should have told someone, Ellis said. This isn't something you keep secret. Ava looked at him with a flicker of weariness. I tried. I told doctors. I told scientists. But no one believed me. And when they did believe, they wanted to turn me into a subject. I wasn't about to let that happen. Marin rubbed her temples, trying to connect the pieces. If it's responding to military infrastructure, maybe it's designed to interface with something deep in the base's systems. But that would mean someone new. Someone built your gate scanner with tech that would trigger her implant. A chill crept down Ellis's spine. That meant it wasn't just an accident. The gate wasn't just a standard security checkpoint. It was a filter, a net designed to catch something just like this. We need to find out who installed the new system, he muttered, already reaching for his secure comms line. And who authorized it? Good luck with that, Ava said, folding her arms. You're going to find a paper trail that ends in nothing but dead ends and code names. I've seen it before. What exactly do you think they want with you? Marin asked, her tone softer now, more curious than clinical. Ava hesitated. She didn't have a perfect answer, but the memories of dreams she'd had, the feelings she couldn't explain, the distant humming that sometimes filled her skull like a song, those told her something bigger was at play. I think I'm a key, she said finally, to something locked away, and now that I've lit up your scanner, someone knows the lock is turning. Ellis stared at her for a long moment. We're moving you into a secure chamber, no more open floors, no more blind assumptions. He looked at Marin. I want 24-hour surveillance and a sweep of every circuit tied to that scanner. He then turned to Ava. And you're going to help us figure out exactly what you're the key to. Ava's expression was unreadable, but inside her chest, she felt the scar vibrate faintly, like a whisper of something ancient and alive. Not dangerous, but purposeful. And whatever it had been waiting for all this time, she was beginning to believe that time had finally arrived. The aircraft buzzed low over the desert, its wings slicing the dusk like a blade through velvet. The base beneath shrank behind them, lights twinkling like a forgotten constellation. Mira sat rigid in her seat, eyes locked on the horizon through the small oval window, her fingers clenched tightly around the fabric of her jacket. Beside her, Commander Reynes leaned forward, speaking into his headset, relaying updates and requesting priority clearance for their landing. Across from them sat two agents from Homeland Oversight, silent and composed, yet betraying a subtle tension that hinted at how little they truly understood about the situation unfolding around Mira. They weren't just transporting a curious anomaly or a girl with a strange scar anymore. They were escorting a living breach in the known rules of history and biology. The moment the aircraft touched down at Fort Nellis, a facility Mira had never heard of, even with all her high-clearance documentation, an army of scientists, analysts, and security personnel was already in place. Rains moved with purpose, shielding Mira from the press of eyes and questions. She noticed that this place lacked insignia, no identifying markers on uniforms or walls. It was beyond classified. Within minutes, Mira found herself standing before a biometric field reader. The same scanner from the base had been replicated here, this time larger, with multiple angular surfaces pointing at her like the arms of a cold mechanical spider. She hesitated, then extended her forearm as instructed. The moment her scar passed through the center beam, the room dimmed. The lights flickered for a heartbeat, then bathed everything in a low amber glow. A technician swore under his breath. On a nearby screen, a complex pattern of data bloomed, symbols in a language no one present could translate but that Mira instinctively understood. It wasn't a barcode, not exactly, It was more like a sequence, one tied not just to her identity but to a lineage, a memory encoded in her cells. She could feel it awaken in her blood, as though the scanner had pulled a switch in her very DNA. Her mind flashed back to that night at the village fire with her mother's stories, the dreams she used to have of skies filled with falling stars and cities not built with hands. They weren't dreams, they were inherited visions. Her body began to shake. Rains rushed forward, catching her before she collapsed, and helped her to a padded bench. The room quieted, tension rising like mist. Later, in a controlled medical suite, Mira lay under an arc of glowing sensors, surrounded by the hum of equipment monitoring her vitals, brain activity, and something else, frequencies beyond human comprehension. Two specialists argued quietly behind a frosted glass pane, pointing at energy readouts that pulsed in impossible ways. "It's not just her scar," one of them said, pressing her palms to her temples. "Her entire system is resonating with something non-terrestrial." Meanwhile, Rainey sat across from an older man in a high-collared suit, face weathered, hair white and buzzed close. His name was General Haverson, and he had once overseen experimental blacksite programs across 5 continents. Now he was leaning back in a metal chair, staring at a screen showing a slowed-down scan of Mira's scar activating. "We always suspected something would come from that perimeter crash," Haverson murmured. "But we thought it would be tech, a drone, a piece of material, not her." Rainey's exhaled deeply. "We need to tell her what we know. We owe her that much." Haverson's gaze didn't shift. "And what do we tell her, Commander? That she may be the first living hybrid ever created? That our enemy, or someone even older, used this planet as an experiment site and she's the proof? We barely understand it ourselves. The moment we speak those words, we shift history." But Mira already knew. As she lay in silence, her mind returned to the dark, silent moments of her childhood. The illness, the heightened senses, the uncanny dreams of stars and fire. She had always felt out of place, like someone living in a world several degrees out of sync with everyone else. Now, the disconnect made sense. Her mother had whispered fragments of it, but never dared speak fully, afraid, or perhaps forbidden. Mira remembered the last letter her mother had ever written, tucked inside a book she hadn't opened in years. It was time to find that letter. Hours passed. Mira was cleared from the medical bay and escorted to a small, private chamber designed for visiting operatives. Inside, everything was clean, sterile, devoid of personality. Yet it felt oddly peaceful. When left alone, she opened her backpack. The book was there, weathered, cloth-bound, its pages yellowed and curling. From the hollow inside, she retrieved the letter. It was short. Her mother's looping script said only, "When they scan you and the light burns, remember this: you were chosen not by accident, but by intention. There is a reason the stars whisper to you, you are not the end, you are the return." Mira closed her eyes. There was something more inside her now, more than fear, more than confusion, a clarity, like a wire being connected after decades of static. The time to question everything had passed. Now was the time to awaken to what she was truly meant to be. But first, she had to find the other half of the story. Who created her and why? And to do that, she'd need to go far beyond the safety of Earth. The sun had barely risen when Alina stood before the sealed door of the classified chamber, her arm already aching with tension from the previous night's events. The underground complex was more than just a storage site. It was a vault for the nation's most dangerous secrets, and now she was about to walk into its very core. The hum of the biometric scanner echoed in the still corridor, the final checkpoint before access was granted. Her team, now silent with uncertainty rather than hostility, waited behind her with cautious eyes. Dr. Velez stood closest, holding a data tablet that displayed rapidly shifting numbers and schematics related to the scar on Alina's arm. The moment her scar had lit up the base scanner days ago, everything changed. The military no longer saw her as an outcast, but as a potential key to something they feared and desired. Alina lifted her left arm and let the scanner glide across it. As it passed over the glowing lines embedded in her skin, the panel emitted a harmonic chime, and the vault's heavy door shuddered, then slowly slid open. A rush of cold air swept out, brushing her skin like a warning. Beyond the threshold was a room bathed in dim blue light, filled with ancient-looking machinery and crystalline panels that shimmered faintly. The design wasn't military. It wasn't even human. Her breath caught as she stepped inside. It wasn't the strangeness of the room that stunned her. It was the overwhelming sense of familiarity. Her feet moved with instinct, guiding her to the center of the chamber, where a pillar of transparent alloy pulsed softly. The moment she neared it, the lines on her arm brightened again, casting patterns on the walls that began to shift and rotate like a celestial map. Behind her, Dr. Velez whispered something to one of the analysts, but Alina was too focused to catch it. Her entire body felt attuned to the chamber, as if her scar wasn't just responding to the technology, it was a part of it. The pillar glowed brighter, and then retracted, revealing a console with a hollow indentation, the exact shape of a human hand. She reached out and placed her palm against it. A surge of heat coursed up her arm and into her spine, almost making her collapse. Images flashed before her eyes. Not memories, but blueprints, histories, and movements across galaxies. She wasn't just connecting with the machine. She was accessing a living archive. Outside the chamber, chaos was unfolding. News of the unlocked vault had reached higher-ups in the defense chain. 2 rapid deployment units had been dispatched, not to assist, but to secure and control. Orders were now being drafted to isolate Alina completely, regardless of what she had just uncovered. Some viewed her as an asset. Others still viewed her as a threat. But Alina was no longer concerned with the military's interpretation. Inside her mind now pulsed an understanding far older than any military protocol. The information she was receiving suggested that she had been altered not as a weapon, but as a guardian. Her scar wasn't a mark of shame or alien possession. It was a key, one passed through generations or perhaps civilizations, designed to be hidden until the world was ready. Dr. Velez called out her name, his voice tense. Behind him, red emergency lights began flashing as the base received the alert of incoming lockdown procedures. Alina turned away from the console and looked at the team. She could see the fear, yes, but also the flicker of belief in some of their eyes. Her presence here was no longer accidental or invasive. It was central. She had unlocked what no one else could. The base's systems were now responding to her. Even the walls pulsed in sync with her breathing. She walked toward a side terminal that had activated, and with another touch of her palm, a screen lit up showing coordinates, deep oceanic locations, isolated islands, and mountain regions that hadn't been charted for decades. The realization struck her. This was not the only vault. This one had awakened because she was close enough, but others were waiting. Whatever the original builders had seeded into Earth, it had been dormant for centuries, maybe millennia, until her presence, and the mark on her skin, stirred them back into motion. Suddenly, Alina wasn't just part of a military scandal. She was part of something much larger, something buried under layers of human misunderstanding and classified paranoia. As she processed this, the room dimmed again, and a low tone vibrated through the chamber. A message scrolled across the main panel, not in English, but her mind translated it without effort. Guardian identified. Protocol initiation sequence phase 2. Outside, the sirens were wailing louder. The special ops team was minutes away, but Alina stood calm in the center of the chamber. The machinery had begun shifting, reconfiguring into a different structure, something more mobile, something adaptable. It was preparing to move, preparing for her to lead. She looked down at her arm one more time, the glow now steady and strong. This was never about being allowed on base. It wasn't about fitting into a military chain of command. This was about awakening, and whatever came next, Alina knew she wasn't alone anymore. The machines didn't just recognize her, they had been waiting for her, and the world, whether it was ready or not, was about to follow. The sudden jolt of the helicopter blades, slicing through the night air, seemed to echo the rapid shift in the atmosphere back at the base. When Ira and General Holt descended from the aircraft and stepped onto the concrete tarmac of Outpost Vanta, a remote and heavily fortified installation deep in the Alaskan wilderness, the reception was immediate and tense. Armed personnel lined up in sharp formation, but their eyes flickered with uncertainty. Every soldier had already heard the radio chatter, the stories of the woman whose scar triggered a level Omega security alert, the kind that overrode even the highest clearance codes. No one had seen the scanner glow like that. Ira stood straight, composed, even as unease tried to seep into her chest. She knew the eyes were on her, not because of her past as an exile, but because of what her presence now represented: an anomaly, a shift in the protocol, a disruption in the carefully controlled fabric of military command. General Holt's voice was crisp as he gave out orders, but even he could sense the undercurrent of apprehension from his officers. The deeper they walked into the outpost, the more it became evident that Ira's existence challenged something sacred, something these men and women had been trained never to question. Once inside the central command chamber, the cold walls lit up with holographic displays and encrypted data flowing across transparent panels. An elite unit of analysts, strategists, and cybersecurity experts awaited them, gathered around a central table showing a three-dimensional map of the globe with glowing nodes blinking ominously. At the center was a pulsating red point over the Arctic Circle, exactly where Ira had indicated the unknown energy field had erupted years ago. Holt began the briefing, laying out the anomalies that had increased over the past few months: seismic spikes, unexplained electromagnetic interference, disappearing surveillance drones, and most recently, an entire recon squad that vanished without a trace. Every clue pointed toward the coordinates Ira had memorized, the same zone where her unit had been ambushed 8 years prior. As she stepped forward to speak, the room fell silent. She pointed at the center of the energy bloom and explained what she had seen back then: the flickering gateway, the inhuman shapes, the bizarre symbols etched into the terrain. Her voice was firm, not just recounting a memory, but drawing a map of something far more vast and terrifying than any conventional military threat. Skepticism met her words, as expected. One colonel, old school and hardened, leaned forward and asked the question they were all thinking. Why would they trust the word of someone who had been dishonorably discharged and erased from protocol? Before Ira could respond, Holt stepped in, not as a superior officer defending his subordinate, but as a witness. He recounted what he had seen with his own eyes at the scanner. Not just the glow, but the strange frequency that had radiated through the room, disrupting electronics and briefly hijacking communications. It was more than a scar. It was a beacon, and it had been activated by proximity to classified systems. Whatever it was connected to something not of this world, or at the very least, something that hadn't been disclosed to even the highest levels of military intelligence. That changed everything. Suddenly, what Ira had seen wasn't delusion, it was evidence. Tangible, measurable, undeniable. And now, they had no choice but to follow the signal. The mission was greenlit that same night. A recon team would accompany Ira back into the Arctic exclusion zone. Holt, against the protest of several advisors, insisted on leading the team personally. He didn't trust anyone else to keep the chain of command clean. The preparations were fast but meticulous: thermal gear, signal disruptors, geolocators tuned to abnormal frequencies, and experimental tech pulled straight from black-budget labs. As the team suited up, Ira stood apart, staring out across the white horizon beyond the outpost's reinforced glass. Her mind returned to the voices she had heard in the in-between, those fragmented echoes in her dreams, or perhaps memories that always pulsed when she touched the scar. They whispered warnings, instructions, even names she didn't recognize. She didn't understand everything yet, but she knew they were waiting for her return. By dawn, the convoy moved across the tundra, hovercraft skimming over ice fields, drone swarms buzzing overhead. What awaited them was more than just the site of a forgotten battle. It was a rift, a scar in the earth as deep and mysterious as the one across Ira's back. Hours later, when they arrived at the frozen coordinates, the land had changed. It was warmer here, unnaturally so. Ice melted around their boots. Trees that shouldn't have existed this far north had sprung up, twisted and ancient. At the center, a circular stone lay half buried in the snow, carved with the same symbols Ira had seen in her dreams. As she stepped closer, her scar flared again, burning under the skin. The scanners went haywire. Instruments overloaded. And then came the pulse, a wave of energy that knocked every soldier off their feet and temporarily blacked out the entire convoy. When Ira stood up, the air was different. The world around her hummed. The stone had opened, no longer solid, but a shimmering aperture into something not yet fully formed. What lay on the other side was indistinct, like a memory still taking shape. But one thing was clear. This was the source, the beginning, the truth behind the scanner, the scar, and the silence that had nearly buried her. She turned to Holt, who was still recovering from the blast, and said the words she had waited 8 years to say, not out of vengeance, but out of purpose. It's time to finish what they tried to erase. And this time, no one would stop her from walking through that doorway. The weeks that followed blurred into a surreal procession of debriefings, tests, and high-level security briefings that even Amara wasn't permitted to speak about afterward. While she had technically cleared her name, the military wasn't willing to let her walk away just yet. The revelation of the activated scar and the classified energy signature had shaken more than one command post. But what kept them up at night wasn't what she had already done, it was what she might become. Scientists who had studied her body under the guise of a routine checkup quietly compiled reports that she only glimpsed in fleeting moments. A few hinted at enhanced neurological pathways. Others speculated about latent genetic anomalies. But what terrified her the most was the possibility that she wasn't the only one out there. One name came up repeatedly in the encrypted files she overheard, the Singularity Project, a term that made seasoned generals flinch and whisper. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about something much larger. And yet, after a final private meeting with Colonel Yates and a group of Pentagon officials, they made a decision that shocked even her. She was to be honorably discharged from all active duty and transferred to what they called a civilian observation program. In other words, she was free, sort of. Amara returned to her small cottage outside the base, trying to rebuild the quiet life she once thought she'd lost forever. For the first few days, she couldn't sleep. Every sound in the night felt like an incoming threat. Every flash of light out her window made her brace for agents in black suits. But none came. Eventually, the silence grew thicker, heavier, more meaningful. She took long walks along the river, sat under the vast open sky, and sometimes caught herself lifting her shirt to examine the faint outline of the scar, half expecting it to light up again. It never did, not since the day it pulsed at the gate. But something inside her had changed. It wasn't just adrenaline. It wasn't paranoia either. It was a deep awareness of something awakened, like a sleeping instinct had stretched and opened its eyes. People in town started treating her differently. Some avoided eye contact, murmuring under their breath about rumors from the base. Others asked bold questions, wondering what she really saw out there. But one afternoon, as she sipped coffee at the diner, a boy no older than 10 approached her table quietly. He didn't say anything at first. He just lifted the sleeve of his hoodie and revealed a faint, jagged scar glowing just beneath his skin. Amara's heart stopped. It was the same pattern, the same faint shimmer. The boy looked scared, confused. She leaned in and whispered, "You're not alone." And from that moment on, everything changed again. Over the next month, she met 3 more like him. None were from the military. One was a woman in her 60s who had lived off-grid most of her life. Another was a mechanic who started hearing strange frequencies through broken engines. The last was a girl who had drawn sketches of star maps she had never seen with her eyes. It wasn't random. They were all being pulled together, magnetized by something deeper than coincidence. Amara realized she wasn't just the subject of some failed government experiment. She was the catalyst of a global mystery that stretched far beyond classified files and secure scanners. So she did the only thing that made sense. She bought a used RV, retrofitted it for long drives, and started tracking stories, sightings, and whispers of others like her. She became a traveler, a seeker, no longer haunted by what she didn't know, but driven by it. The scar had given her more than pain, more than trouble. It had given her purpose. A map etched in light across her body, a reminder that some destinies can't be buried or silenced. They can only be followed. And as she drove through dusty highways, stopping in towns where people still remembered her from the headlines, she never advertised herself. She didn't need to. Those who needed her found her. She became known in quiet circles as the Spark Bearer, a name whispered by those who had seen the impossible and lived to tell of it. Some said she was a myth. Others swore she had saved their lives. But Amara never corrected them. She just kept moving forward, scar-silent but present, waiting for the day it would glow again, not as a warning, but as a signal. A beginning, not an end. Because whatever project had started with her, wherever that strange energy had come from, it wasn't finished. It had only just begun. And she was ready for whatever came next. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.